The sun was bright overhead, that particular kind of Saturday afternoon brightness that makes suburban driveways shimmer with heat. Director Cassandra Moore was standing in her own garage, wearing paint-stained jeans and an old Georgetown Law t-shirt, organizing storage bins she'd been meaning to sort through for 6 months. Her hands were dusty from the cardboard boxes, and she'd pulled her natural hair into a messy bun that probably looked more college student than federal law enforcement executive. She was reaching for a bin labeled holiday decorations when she heard the voice. Sharp, demanding, cutting through the quiet residential air like a siren. Excuse me. Excuse me. What exactly do you think you're doing? Cassandra turned to see a white woman in her mid-50s standing at the end of her driveway, hands on hips, designer sunglasses perched on highlighted hair, wearing the kind of athleisure outfit that costs more than most people's monthly car payments. The woman's face was twisted into an expression of aggressive suspicion, the look of someone who'd appointed herself neighborhood watchdog and took the job seriously. Cassandra blinked, momentarily confused about whether this stranger was talking to her. "I'm sorry, can I help you?" The woman took 3 steps forward, her white tennis shoes crisp against the concrete. "I said, what are you doing in this garage? This is a private residence and I've never seen you before. I'm going to need you to step away from the property immediately or I'm calling the police." Cassandra felt the familiar weight settle in her chest, that particular exhaustion that comes from being Black in America and having to explain your right to exist in spaces you've earned. She took a slow breath and kept her voice level. "I live here. This is my house." The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, her suspicion intensified. "I don't think so. I know everyone on this street, and I've never seen you before. The family that lives here is very respectable, and they wouldn't appreciate squatters or thieves going through their belongings." Cassandra almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sound died in her throat when she saw the woman already had her phone in her hand, finger hovering over the screen. "Ma'am, I'm telling you, I own this house. I moved in 3 months ago. My name is on the deed. I'm literally standing in my own garage organizing my own storage bins." The woman shook her head with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she was wrong. "I'm the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and I have a responsibility to report suspicious activity. You need to leave now or I will have you arrested for trespassing and attempted burglary. And trust me, honey, I know people. I know the sheriff personally. You'll be in handcuffs within 10 minutes. If you're watching this and you already feel that knot of injustice tightening in your stomach, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button because this story goes somewhere you won't believe. Somewhere that proves karma doesn't just exist in fairy tales. Share this with someone who needs to see that standing your ground matters and that sometimes the person you're threatening is exactly the wrong person to threaten. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about what happens when arrogance meets consequence, when assumptions crash into reality, and when justice shows up in the most unexpected ways. Now let me tell you who Cassandra Moore really was, because this woman standing in her garage being threatened with arrest had a story that would make this HOA president's blood run cold if she'd bothered to ask instead of assume. Cassandra Moore had been with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 23 years. She'd started as a field agent fresh out of Georgetown Law, working white-collar crime in the D.C. office. She'd built cases against corporate executives who thought they were untouchable, politicians who'd confused public service with personal enrichment, and organized crime figures who'd spent decades evading justice. She was methodical, patient, and had a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous when they saw her name on the prosecution's witness list. 14 years into her career, she'd been promoted to Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigative Division. 3 years ago, she'd been appointed Deputy Director of the entire FBI, the second highest position in the Bureau, overseeing 56 field offices and 35,000 employees. She reported directly to the FBI Director and the Attorney General. She'd testified before Congress 17 times. She had security clearance so high that most of the work she did couldn't be discussed outside of secured facilities. And 6 months ago, she'd quietly taken a leave of absence from her public-facing duties to lead a task force investigating something the Bureau had been tracking for 2 years, a sophisticated mortgage fraud and money laundering operation that had stolen approximately $400 million from vulnerable homeowners across 7 states. The investigation had led her here, to Willowbrook Estates, a planned community 30 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. A community where property values had inexplicably skyrocketed over the past 3 years, despite economic conditions that should have caused the opposite. A community where dozens of families, primarily elderly and minority homeowners, had lost their properties to foreclosure under circumstances that didn't quite add up when you look closely. A community where the HOA had accumulated unusual amounts of power and financial resources. A community run for the past 6 years by a woman named Patricia Hendricks, the same woman who is currently standing in Cassandra's driveway, threatening to have her arrested for standing in her own garage. Cassandra had bought the house under her maiden name, Morgan, paying cash through a shell company the FBI used for undercover property acquisitions. Her background check would show she worked as a compliance consultant for a boring financial services firm. Her neighbors would have no idea that the quiet black woman who moved in 3 months ago and mostly kept to herself was actually a federal law enforcement executive who'd spent the past 90 days methodically documenting every irregular HOA action, every suspicious property transfer, and every financial connection that linked Patricia Hendricks to the largest mortgage fraud scheme the Bureau had seen in a decade. Patricia Hendricks had no idea she was already finished. She didn't know that Cassandra had copies of every fraudulent document Patricia had filed. She didn't know that the FBI had been monitoring her communications for 8 months. She didn't know that 3 of her co-conspirators had already flipped and were cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. She didn't know that the pleasant woman she'd had coffee with at the HOA meeting 2 months ago, the one who'd asked such thoughtful questions about property assessments and foreclosure procedures, had been wearing a recording device that captured Patricia bragging about cleaning up the neighborhood and making sure the right kind of people owned homes in Willowbrook Estates. Patricia Hendricks thought she was confronting a trespasser. She had no idea she was threatening the one person in Virginia who had the evidence and the authority to destroy everything she'd built. But Cassandra wasn't ready to reveal that yet. She needed one more piece, one more incident that would demonstrate the pattern of discrimination and abuse of power that had allowed Patricia's scheme to flourish. And here was Patricia, walking right into the trap, providing evidence in real time on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Cassandra kept her voice calm, reasonable, the tone she'd perfected in hundreds of interrogations. Ms. Hendricks, I understand you're concerned about the neighborhood. I appreciate that, but I really do live here. If you'd like, I can show you my ID and the deed to the property. Patricia's face flushed red. How do you know my name? Have you been stalking me? That's it. I'm calling the police right now. She dialed with exaggerated movements, making sure Cassandra saw every button press. Cassandra noticed the small camera mounted on her garage, the one she'd installed specifically for moments like this, the one currently recording everything in high definition. Patricia spoke into her phone with the authoritative tone of someone who'd never been told no by law enforcement. Yes, hello, this is Patricia Hendricks calling from 847 Maple Ridge Drive in Willowbrook Estates. I need an officer immediately. There's a woman trespassing in one of our community's homes. She's going through the garage. She's clearly burglarizing the property. Yes, she's still here. Black female, 30s, about 5'7". She's being aggressive and confrontational. I feel very threatened. Please hurry. Cassandra felt a flash of anger at the lies, at the weaponization of fear, at the casual way Patricia had just painted her as a criminal and a threat to a police dispatcher who'd send officers based on that description. The police arrived in 8 minutes. 2 patrol cars, 3 officers, all with hands resting near their weapons as they approached. Cassandra kept her hands visible and her movements slow, painfully aware of how these situations could escalate. How many news stories started exactly this way? The senior officer, a man in his 40s with Sergeant Morrison on his nameplate, approached with cautious eyes. Ma'am, we received a report of a possible burglary in progress. Can you explain what you're doing here? Cassandra met his gaze steadily. I own this house, officer. I live here. I was organizing my garage when Mrs. Hendricks approached and accused me of trespassing. Patricia stepped forward before the officer could respond. Don't listen to her, Tom. She's lying. I know everyone in this neighborhood, and I've never seen her before. The real owners wouldn't tolerate someone squatting in their property. Sergeant Morrison's expression shifted slightly at the use of his first name, the familiarity that suggested Patricia had called in complaints before. Ma'am, do you have identification and proof of ownership? Cassandra nodded slowly. I do. It's inside the house. May I go get it? She saw the officers exchange glances, the calculation happening behind their eyes. I'll accompany you, Morrison said. Officers, please stay here with garage into the house, acutely aware that he was watching her movements, his hand still hovering near his service weapon. She kept her movements deliberate and unthreatening as she walked to the kitchen counter where she'd left her purse that morning. She pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license. He examined it carefully, and she saw the moment his eyes caught the address, 847 Maple Ridge Drive. His expression shifted to confusion. This is your current address? Yes, sir, it is. And you said you own the property? I do. She pulled out her phone, opened her Files app, and showed him a PDF of the deed. He read it carefully, then looked back at her with an expression that was one part embarrassment and two parts frustration. Ms. Morgan, I apologize for the confusion. Obviously, you have every right to be here. I'll explain the situation to Ms. Hendricks. Cassandra made a decision in that moment, one she'd been planning for, but hadn't expected to execute quite this soon. Sergeant Morrison, before we go back out there, there's something you should know. She reached into her purse and pulled out her federal credentials, the ones she'd kept hidden for 3 months. She flipped open the leather case to reveal her FBI badge and identification card. My name is Cassandra Moore. I'm the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I'm currently leading an investigation into mortgage fraud and HOA corruption in this community. What just happened out there, Ms. Hendricks calling the police on a black homeowner engaged in legal activity on her own property, is part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has enabled a criminal enterprise. I need you to act as if you don't know this information when we return outside. Can you do that? Sergeant Morrison's face went through several shades of pale. He stared at the badge, then at Cassandra, then back at the badge. His hand, which had been resting near his weapon, dropped to his side. You're Deputy Director Moore? His voice had gone quiet with the kind of awe that comes from suddenly realizing you're talking to someone several dozen pay grades above your own supervisor. I've seen you testify before Congress. I've read about the Thompson case and the pharmaceutical executives. You put away half the New Jersey mob. Cassandra allowed herself a small smile. That's me. And right now, I need you to trust that what I'm asking you to do is part of an active federal investigation. Go back out there, tell Ms. Hendricks that my identification checks out and that I'm the legal owner of the property. Watch how she reacts. Don't mention my real name or my position. Just tell her she was wrong and that she needs to leave my property. Can you do that? Morrison nodded. His entire demeanor had shifted from suspicious officer to respectful subordinate. Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Do you need any assistance with the investigation? Should I contact my supervisor? Cassandra shook her head. Not yet. We're close to making arrests and I don't want to spook anyone. Just play this out normally. Tell your fellow officers the situation is resolved. Make sure Ms. Hendricks understands she was wrong. I'll take it from there. Morrison straightened his posture unconsciously, the way people do when they suddenly realize they're part of something bigger. Understood, ma'am. They walked back outside together where Patricia was talking animatedly to the other 2 officers about property values and neighborhood security and how she'd been right to call because you couldn't be too careful these days. Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through Patricia's monologue. Ms. Hendricks, I've confirmed that Ms. Morgan is the legal owner of this property. Her identification and deed are in order. There is no trespassing occurring here. Patricia's mouth opened and closed. That's impossible. I would have been notified of any new residents. The HOA requires notification of all property sales. She can't just move in here without going through the proper channels. Morrison's tone was firm now, official. Ma'am, property ownership is a matter of public record and doesn't require HOA approval. Ms. Morgan has every right to be here, and every right to use her own garage however she sees fit. I'm going to need you to leave her property now." Patricia's face flushed darker. "This is ridiculous. Tom, you know me. You know I wouldn't call if there wasn't a real problem. Something isn't right here. She doesn't fit the profile of our typical homeowners. I have a responsibility to the community to maintain standards." Cassandra heard the careful coding in Patricia's words, the way she'd learned to express discrimination without saying anything that could be quoted in a lawsuit. But Cassandra had recorded dozens of hours of Patricia being far less careful, using far more explicit language when she thought she was among friends. Morrison's expression had gone cold. "Ms. Hendricks, you need to leave now. If you continue to harass this resident, I'll be filing a report for making a false police report." Patricia looked between Morrison and Cassandra, her face a mask of outrage and confusion. "Fine, but this isn't over. The HOA board will be hearing about this. We have rules about notification and community standards. You can't just move into Willowbrook Estates and expect to do whatever you want." She turned on her heel and stalked back toward her own house 3 doors down, her phone already at her ear, no doubt calling other board members to share her version of events. After Patricia left and the patrol cars pulled away, Cassandra stood in her driveway for a long moment, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her system. She'd been threatened, profiled, and nearly arrested on her own property, and instead of anger, she felt the cold satisfaction of watching a target eliminate any remaining doubt about her guilt. Patricia had just demonstrated, in front of 3 police officers and on camera, exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that had allowed her to target vulnerable homeowners for years. Cassandra pulled out her phone and sent a brief text message to the assistant U.S. attorney who'd been working the case with her. "Incident occurred. Documented. Recommend we move up timeline." The response came within 60 seconds. "Warrants are ready. Green light for Monday morning." Cassandra looked down the street toward Patricia's house, a large colonial with elaborate landscaping and a 3-car garage. In 72 hours, that house would be swarmed with federal agents executing search warrants. Patricia's computers would be seized, her bank records would be frozen, and she would be sitting in an interrogation room in the FBI's Richmond field office, learning that the woman she'd threatened with arrest was actually the person who'd been building a criminal case against her for 6 months. Cassandra allowed herself to imagine that moment, the look on Patricia's face when she realized exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. The investigation had started, like most FBI cases, with a pattern that didn't quite make sense. An analyst in the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit had noticed an unusual number of foreclosures in certain planned communities, all following similar timelines, all involving homeowners who'd taken out second mortgages or home equity lines of credit that they claimed they'd never applied for. The mortgages were processed through a network of small lending companies that appeared legitimate on the surface, but shared overlapping ownership and unusually high default rates. When the FBI started mapping the connections, they found HOA boards at the center of most cases, particularly HOA presidents who seemed to have extensive knowledge of their neighbors' financial situations. Patricia Hendricks' name appeared in connection with 47 foreclosures over 3 years. That was the number that got the Bureau's attention. 47 families who'd lost their homes in a community of only 300 houses. 47 foreclosures where the properties were subsequently purchased at auction by shell companies that were, when you trace the paperwork back far enough, controlled by Patricia and her business partners. The families who lost their homes were disproportionately elderly, minority, or both. People who might not fully understand the paperwork they were signing. People who might not have lawyers on speed dial. People who could be pressured, confused, or frightened into deals that benefited everyone except them. Cassandra had volunteered to go undercover because this case felt personal in a way that most of her work didn't anymore. At her level, she usually coordinated investigations from conference rooms and secure facilities, reviewing reports and making strategic decisions, but rarely getting her hands dirty with actual fieldwork. But this case reminded her why she joined the FBI in the first place. Her own grandmother had lost her house to a predatory lending scheme when Cassandra was in college, a beautiful row house in Philadelphia that had been in their family for 40 years, stolen through paperwork her grandmother hadn't understood, and penalties that multiplied faster than she could pay them. Cassandra had been powerless to stop it then, a 20-year-old student who knew something was wrong but didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back. She'd watched her grandmother move into a cramped apartment, seen the light dim in her eyes, heard her apologize for losing the house that was supposed to be Cassandra's inheritance someday. That loss had fueled every case Cassandra worked, every fraud investigation she led, every criminal she helped put away. And when she saw Patricia Hendricks' pattern of targeting the same kind of vulnerable people who'd victimized her grandmother, she'd made the decision to take 3 months away from her executive duties and become just another resident of Willowbrook Estates. The deputy director of the FBI spending her Saturday mornings at HOA meetings and her afternoons organizing a garage, all to get close enough to document exactly how Patricia operated. The Monday morning raid was executed with the precision that comes from months of planning. Cassandra wasn't there for the actual arrest. She was in the FBI's Richmond field office, watching the operation unfold through body camera feeds and listening to radio traffic as 23 agents simultaneously executed search warrants at Patricia's house, her office, and the offices of 3 lending companies connected to the scheme. She watched Patricia answer her door in a silk bathrobe, confusion turning to fear as agents identified themselves and presented the warrant. She listened as Patricia demanded to speak to her lawyer, her voice climbing to a pitch that suggested she was beginning to understand just how much trouble she was in. The evidence seizure took 4 hours. Computers, phones, filing cabinets full of documents, external hard drives, even Patricia's personal planners where she kept meticulous notes about which neighbors were behind on their HOA dues and which ones might be vulnerable to financial pressure. It was the kind of comprehensive collation that made prosecutors happy because it meant there would be no questions about what Patricia knew and when she knew it. Everything was documented in her own handwriting, organized in her own filing system, saved on her own devices. And when agents found the folder labeled Maple Ridge Acquisition that contained forged documents with Cassandra's signature on a loan application she'd never filled out, they knew they had attempted fraud on top of everything else. Patricia was brought to the field office at 1:30 in the afternoon. Cassandra watched through the one-way glass as agents escorted her into the interrogation room, still wearing the expensive athleisure outfit she'd thrown on after they told her she needed to come in for questioning. Patricia's lawyer, a defense attorney named Gerald Marks, who specialized in white-collar crime, arrived 20 minutes later, looking like he already knew this was going to be a bad day. The interrogation was handled by 2 senior agents from the criminal division, but Cassandra had planned to make an appearance. She wanted Patricia to see her face. She wanted Patricia to have that moment of recognition, that instant when arrogance crumbled into understanding. She waited until the agents had gone through the preliminary questions, until Patricia had denied everything with the indignant confidence of someone who still thought she could talk her way out of trouble. Then Cassandra opened the door and walked into the interrogation room. Patricia looked up, irritated at the interruption, and her eyes met Cassandra's. For 3 full seconds, Patricia didn't recognize her. Then Cassandra saw it happen, the way Patricia's brain connected the woman in the professional suit with the woman she'd threatened in a garage 3 days earlier. The color drained from Patricia's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her lawyer looked between them, confused. "Do you 2 know each other?" Cassandra pulled out a chair and sat down across from Patricia. She set her credentials on the table, the FBI badge catching the fluorescent light. "Ms. Hendricks, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. My name is Cassandra Moore. I'm the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've been leading the investigation into your mortgage fraud operation for the past 6 months. I've also been your neighbor for the past 3 months, living at 847 Maple Ridge Drive, the house where you threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property." Patricia's breathing had gone shallow. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but Patricia didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at Cassandra like she was seeing a ghost. You said your name was Morgan. You said you worked in compliance." Cassandra nodded. "I did say that. Morgan is my maiden name. And I do work in compliance, specifically ensuring compliance with federal law. You tried to process a fraudulent loan application using my name and forged signature last week. That application is currently with the U.S. Attorney as evidence of attempted mortgage fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Combined with the 47 other cases we've documented, you're looking at approximately 230 individual federal charges. The sentencing guidelines suggest somewhere between 25 and 40 years in federal prison, plus full restitution to your victims, which our economists estimate at $400 million. Patricia found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. This is entrapment. You lied about who you were. You can't use anything you learned while pretending to be someone else. Cassandra shook her head. That's not how entrapment works, Miss Hendricks. I didn't encourage you to commit any crimes. I didn't pressure you into anything. I simply lived in a house I legally purchased and observed your actions. Everything we're charging you with, you would have done whether I was there or not. The 47 families you defrauded before I arrived prove that. I just made sure we documented it properly this time. She pulled out a folder and opened it to reveal the first page of the criminal complaint. You threatened me with arrest on Saturday for organizing my own garage. You called the police and filed a false report claiming I was burglarizing a property I own. You told the dispatcher I was being aggressive and that you felt threatened, none of which was true. You did all of that because you saw a black woman in a nice neighborhood and assumed she didn't belong there. That assumption is the same bias that let you target minority owners for years, convincing yourself you were protecting property values when really you were stealing their homes and their equity. Patricia's lawyer put a hand on her arm. Ms. Hendricks, don't say anything else. We need to discuss this privately. But Patricia wasn't listening to him. She was staring at Cassandra with something that looked like betrayed rage. You set me up. This whole thing was a setup. Cassandra's voice stayed level. No, ma'am. You set yourself up. You built a criminal enterprise that stole from vulnerable people. I just made sure we had enough evidence to prove it. The interrogation lasted another 40 minutes, but Patricia didn't say anything else substantive. Her lawyer finally got through to her that silence was her best option. When they were done, agents escorted her to a holding cell to await her initial appearance before a federal magistrate judge. Bail would be set high, probably high enough that even Patricia's considerable assets wouldn't cover it. She'd spend the next few months in federal custody waiting for a trial that her own meticulous record-keeping had already decided. Cassandra walked out of the interrogation room and headed to the conference room where her team had assembled. 15 agents and prosecutors, all looking energized by the successful execution of the warrants. The evidence was even better than they'd hoped. Not just Patricia's records, but communications with her co-conspirators that showed the full scope of the operation. Text messages where they joked about cleaning up the neighborhood and making sure certain people didn't get comfortable in Willowbrook Estates. Bank records showing millions of dollars in profits from reselling foreclosed properties. A whole ecosystem of fraud and discrimination documented in excruciating detail by people who'd never imagined they'd be held accountable. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Torres, grinned at Cassandra. That was beautiful. Did you see her face when you walked in? Cassandra allowed herself a smile. I did. That was worth 3 months of HOA meetings. The room laughed and someone started